through my program at the University of New Mexico, and that was also the program that Chris had been talking about. So all of the original Dene project data and the Navajo birth cohort study have come through there. And then also we have staff and community representatives from Crow Nation, from the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe, from Navajo, as I mentioned. Also researchers from Montana State University and from the University of Washington, and then our colleagues from the Southwest Research and Information Center and Missouri Breaks Industries up from Dakota Nations. It's not a surprise to US EPA, for example, that a lot of the traditional lifestyle and cultural patterns lead to differences in exposure, that they lead to potential differences in health outcomes. Tribal communities have been left out of the general body of scientific data that people use to develop standards and to develop risk assessment methodologies and to develop the relationships between exposure and toxicities. We're continuing our focus on abandoned hard rock mines, specifically uranium mines, as the primary focus. The circles that you see here indicate the distribution of just the abandoned uranium mines. There's over 4,000 of them in the 15 western states. Those same states are home to 161,000 abandoned hard rock mines. And the reason I bring in the broader number of mines is that when you start looking at the toxicity of these metals, many of them act in very, very similar manners. And if they don't act in the same manner, the presence of more than one of them is likely to change the effect of one. And we had an excellent demonstration of that on the selenium mercury discussion. And so what we're looking at is Navajo Nation, where we initially started all of this work, where we have over 500 abandoned uranium mines and 1,100 features. And these are the waste piles that are associated with the mine but may be located distally from it, and so they're another exposure source. If we look at the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe, where we've been working for a long time, it looks like it's sitting out here well away from the mining district. What I'll demonstrate is that these mines up in the Black Hills actually are still draining down into rivers that have been a life source for the Cheyenne River Tribe for generations. And one of the things that's interesting is on the Crow, contaminants of concern, we had uranium and manganese, and since then arsenic has actually been added to that list as well. So we're actually looking at very similar contaminant distributions between the tribes, or among the tribes rather, and also in terms of pathways. Initially we thought the food and drinking water would be the same, but that the airborne might be different. I think it'll still be different, but when I was up on Crow a few weeks ago and talking with John, there may be some potential for us to be looking at that pathway there as well. So just to give you some pictorial idea of what we're talking about, when we talk about these abandoned mines and tribal lands, this is a waste pile from the largest underground uranium mine in the country, which was located on this mesa. This is the waste ore that was pushed over the edge. The waste material that was pushed over the edge. And there's a community here with about anywhere from 45 to 60 people living in it. And Chris had showed these photos earlier, but we're looking at multi-generational exposures. This child is now watching as 18 inches of contaminated soil are removed from around the home he grew up in the ground that he's played on all of his life. And we are now in the 4th generation that's been raised in the shadow of this waste pile, and you can see with this arrow, the waste is still there, it's just the soil that's been removed. What you can see to the left of this child is another abandoned mine waste pile that has had a cover put on it, but the cover's eroded, it was never a radon barrier, and so did little to actually stop exposure. When we look at Crow, if we look up in the Bighorn Mountains, we see over 50 abandoned uranium mines, and they drain down into the Little Bighorn and the Bighorn River, which are the regions where the population lives that is also reliant on groundwater through private wells for their domestic water source. And again, you can see Mari and John and their crew out trying to collect samples from these wells. There was a Homestead gold mine up in the Black Hills where it's over on the other side of the state, and you wouldn't think it would have much impact down there. this band that's demonstrated here by this orange bar, which is a little hard to see, but basically from here to here, is actually arsenic-contaminated sediment that was deposited during flood stages. So the Homestake Gold Mine was in the Black Hills. They dumped all of their waste into Whitewater Creek, which entered into the Belfish River, which entered into the Cheyenne River, and ultimately into the Missouri. The arsenic was deposited through the flooding, and the floodplains on this river can go as much as half to 3/4 of a mile back from the riverbanks. And so it takes in quite a section of the available ranchland and farmland that the tribe relies on. In addition, it's the area of the tribe where all of the food sources and the traditional medicinal herbs are grown, and also a lot of the forage that's used for livestock. So the anticipated benefits that we see from this center is that by combining the perspectives of these three tribes, we're going to start to build a common data set that hopefully we can all be adding to. As I see, there's the same questions that are being addressed by virtually everybody in this room, and being able to create the framework within which these site-specific details can be added or altered as necessary, but at least to provide this consistent infrastructure that builds on everything that all of us have been doing for decades. And that this can document and characterize some of these unique exposures, identify the toxicologic responses, what's common, what's different across different tribes or within different sectors of a community, and work to define health and interpret the data within this integrated tribal perspective so that that definition of health that the risk assessment is ultimately trying to get to is broadened and appropriate for the questions that are being asked. And then another really key part of this center that we really hope we can accomplish over the next 5 years, or at least start to accomplish over the next 5 years, is to meet what was identified by our tribal partners as a need to understand the data interpretation. And dating back 20 to 30 years, there's been a lot of emphasis by a lot of different federal agencies in training tribal staff and funding tribal staff to develop sampling plans, to understand QA and QC plans, to be able to collect data and ship it off to a lab. And there's a lot of frustration about this black box that you do all of this work to collect the samples and then they disappear and you get a report back, and a frustration with we're missing that middle piece on how do the data really get analyzed and how do we interpret those results. And so one of the things we want to do with the center is also bring people from the tribal communities in to spend a number of weeks over the summer to have some hands-on time to both analyze their samples and then also to work with us on interpretation so that they understand what the sort of Western science approach to interpretation is, but we as researchers understand more how those data need to be interpreted to have an impact on tribal policy. So we think there's a lot of strength to be gained through this integration across the programs. All of the projects that we're working on have actually been ongoing for many years through different funding streams. And what we've come down to is that in all of the projects, these same questions keep coming up. Issues around dysfunctional immune systems, that people are more prone to infection, that infections are more aggressive, that there's much higher rates of autoimmunity, that there's higher rates of antinuclear antibody, which is sort of a precursor to an autoimmune response, but an indication that something's not right in the system, that you're somehow making antibodies to your own tissue. And so seeing that these are common concerns and that we have some common exposures and that there is actually scientific data from other cultures that show links and from laboratory studies that show links between these exposures and outcomes, we wanted to use this as the main focus of the research outcomes on the health effects and the toxicology. And what we find out is that the data sets that have been collected across the different communities do differ from each other. And so one of the big goals of the center is going to be to come up with a common data set across all three communities so we can do some direct comparisons. And what I mean by that is we may have ANA data from one tribe and we may have cytokine data or DNA damage data from another, but to have equivalent data sets across all three communities, to having equivalent measurements of the environmental exposures. We may have drinking water exposure in one We may have air emissions exposure in another, but to be able to have the food and the air and the water from all of the communities and put it together with the common endpoints is going to very much strengthen the case to be made in developing this model assessment strategy. So again, we're leveraging on a large body of other funded work, including the Dene Project and the NBCS, which you heard about through Chris's work, and the work that Mari and John have been doing, and then work we've done with Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe through both NIEHS and NARCH funding as well. So the basic questions then are, whether the exposure toxicity relationships are consistent across all of these communities. If not, why? Is it the mixture of metals? We know that metals, when they're combined, have very different effects. Is it the form the metals are in? And that can have major effects in terms of how they're absorbed, in terms of how they're distributed in the body, in terms of how they're metabolized, how they're cleared. Are there differences in the routes and the pathways of exposure that are related to those differences in the metals? Are the cultural and traditional practices different? Are there nutritional differences and differences in the disparities that we think about that can be setting a stage for a different toxicologic response? And by comparing individuals within the tribes and looking at the full range of exposures and variables across the tribes, we think we can unravel some of these questions.